We laughed when he danced. We laughed when he stammered. But just look at his medical records, and no one can laugh anymore. What really happened to Boris Yeltsin, hidden behind his comical exterior, was a horrific medical tragedy that the Kremlin tried to conceal. This is the stark truth about Russia's most unstable president. He ran a nuclear superpower while being unable to control his own body. He was not born into the Moscow elite or St. Petersburg intellectuals. He was born in Butka, a peasant village deep in the Ural Mountains. Life there was brutal. In that environment, vodka was not a luxury. It was a necessity. It functioned as currency, as a painkiller, and as a shield against the freezing 6-month winters. In the culture of the Russian peasantry, heavy drinking was not a vice. It was a test of strength. It was how you proved you were a mujik, a real man. The physical evidence of his reckless nature was visible on his own body long before he took office. If you look closely at archival photos of Yeltsin's left hand, you will see 2 fingers are missing. As a child, during the hunger of the Second World War, he stole a live grenade from a military depot simply to see how it worked. He tried to disassemble it with a hammer. It exploded. He lost his thumb and forefinger. This is the hamartia, the fatal flaw of Boris Yeltsin, established early in life, a compulsion to tamper with dangerous forces, regardless of the risk. He survived the grenade, but the psychological pattern was set. He believed he was indestructible. He believed he could endure anything. Yeltsin's career began in the brutal world of Soviet construction. This is crucial context for his later addiction. Far from an academic, he began as a foreman. In the Soviet industrial sector, alcohol was the grease that kept the gears turning. Supplies were always short, and the weather was always lethal. To get bricks, you bribe the supplier with vodka. To get the workers to finish a shift in minus 30 degrees, you paid them in vodka. Yeltsin didn't just observe this, he participated in it. He prided himself on being able to outwork and outdrink his subordinates. This was his leadership style, glass for glass diplomacy. If he drank with you, he trusted you. If he drank you under the table, he dominated you. His tolerance for alcohol became legendary in the Sverdlovsk region. He developed a physiological capacity that would have killed a lesser man. But this high tolerance was a trap. It masked the early stages of chemical dependency. The man who could drink a bottle of vodka and still inspect a construction site believed he was in control. In reality, the substance was already rewriting his neural pathways. Even then, the organs of state security were watching. Declassified KGB files from his time as the party boss of Sverdlovsk note his heavy drinking. However, in the Soviet era, this was not a disqualifier. It was almost expected. A teetotaler was viewed with suspicion. What was he hiding? A drinker was transparent. But there was a darker psychological element at play. Yeltsin was a man of extreme highs and extreme lows. He was cyclothymic. When he was manic, he worked 20 hours a day, bulldozing obstacles. When the adrenaline faded, he crashed into deep, paralyzing depressions. Alcohol became the bridge between these two states. It was the regulator he used to manage his own volatile chemistry. When Mikhail Gorbachev brought Yeltsin to Moscow in 1985 to clean up the corruption in the capital, Yeltsin brought his Ural habits with him. But Moscow was not a construction site. The stress here was not physical. It was political, psychological, and vicious. Yeltsin positioned himself as the outsider, the populist, who rode the bus and stood in line for bread. This created immense pressure. He was one man against the entire Soviet apparatus. The system hated him. He was spied on, wiretapped, and sabotaged at every turn. To cope with this profound isolation, the drinking moved from the social sphere to the private sphere. This is the critical transition in the pathology of addiction. He began to drink alone. He began to drink to sleep. He began to drink to stop the hands from shaking. In 1987, after being expelled from the Politburo in a humiliating public session, Yeltsin suffered a breakdown. He was hospitalized. The official diagnosis was heart trouble. The reality was a nervous collapse exacerbated by heavy alcohol use. Reports suggest he was suicidal. He sat in his room, staring at the wall, stripped of his power. It was here, in the depths of defeat, that the bond with the bottle was sealed. It was the only thing that didn't judge him. But he returned, and when he returned, he was angrier, more radical, and more dependent on his coping mechanism than ever before. The alcohol gave him the Dutch courage to do the unthinkable, to challenge the Communist Party itself. For Yeltsin, alcohol was inextricably linked to his success. In his mind, the bottle was not his enemy, it was his ally. It had helped him survive the cold of the Urals. It had helped him bond with the workers. It had helped him numb the pain of his political exile. He did not see it as a threat. Then came the moment that defined the century. August 19, 1991. The hardline communists staged a coup to reverse the reforms. Tanks rolled into Moscow. This was Yeltsin's finest hour. He climbed atop tank number 110 outside the White House. He read a decree declaring the coup illegal. He looked like a statue of defiance. His hair was silver in the wind. His voice was booming. At this specific moment, he was sober. The massive adrenaline of the confrontation had temporarily replaced the need for ethanol. The world saw a hero. They saw a colossus who could stop an army with his voice. But this image was the peak. It was the summit. From this moment on, the trajectory would only go down. The coup collapsed. The Soviet Union disintegrated, and Boris Yeltsin found himself master of the Kremlin. He had won the war, but the peace would destroy him. The reality of governing a collapsed empire hit him immediately. The economy was in freefall. People were starving. Crime was exploding. The weight of responsibility was crushing. Yeltsin had no experience in macroeconomics. He had no experience in international diplomacy. He was a demolition expert who had just been asked to build a cathedral. He felt inadequate. He felt besieged. And the old remedy was waiting in the drawer of the presidential desk. By 1992, the social drinker from the Urals had vanished. In his place was a functioning alcoholic with access to the nuclear codes. The inner circle, his bodyguards, his family, his aides, began to notice the changes. The slurred speech in the morning, the inexplicable cancellations of meetings, the sudden irrational bursts of rage followed by weepiness. The warning signs were blinking red, but the West chose to ignore them. They needed Yeltsin to succeed. They needed him to be the democratic savior. So a collective denial set in. When he stumbled, it was fatigue. When he rambled, it was eccentricity. But the body keeps the score. The vodka was beginning to attack the central nervous system. It was eroding his frontal lobe, the part of the brain responsible for impulse control and social inhibition. The filter was dissolving. The muzhik was about to lose control of the president. The stage was set for the public unraveling. The private vice was about to become a global spectacle, and it would begin not in a back room in Moscow, but under the bright lights of international diplomacy, where the cameras were always rolling and forgiveness was nowhere to be found. The morning after the revolution is always the most dangerous time for a revolutionary. When the tanks withdrew from Moscow in August 1991 and the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist in December, Boris Yeltsin was left standing on the rubble of history. The adrenaline that had sustained him, the sheer electric thrill of physical danger, evaporated instantly. What replaced it was a terrifying silence. The cheering crowds went home, the cameras turned off, and Boris Yeltsin was left alone in the Kremlin, a fortress designed for czars and dictators, facing a task that was administratively impossible. He had destroyed the old world, but he had no idea how to build a new one. This psychological vacuum is the critical patient zero moment for the escalation of his alcoholism. The medical reality of what was happening to his body was undeniable. For years, Yeltsin had operated on a cycle of high-stress manic energy followed by depressive crashes. Without a new enemy to fight, the mania had nowhere to go. The depression began to settle in like a permanent fog. To replicate the chemical high of the revolution and to numb the crushing anxiety of the administration, he turned to the only reliable tool he knew. The bottle was no longer a social lubricant. It became a structural pillar of his presidency. By early 1992, the shock therapy economic reforms initiated by his young Prime Minister, Yegor Gaidar, began to tear the social fabric of Russia apart. This was the first major psychological fracture. Yeltsin, the man who prided himself on being the people's czar, the man who rode the trolley bus with the workers, was now the man signing decrees that wiped out their life savings. Inflation hit 2,500%. Grandmothers were standing in the freezing metro tunnels selling their personal belongings for a loaf of bread. Yeltsin could not handle this reality. He was not a sociopath. He felt the guilt acutely, but he lacked the emotional maturity to process it. Instead of facing the suffering of his people, he retreated. Security logs and testimonies from this period show a distinct pattern of avoidance. When the economic news was bad, the president would vanish. He would retreat to his dacha in Zavidovo, a hunting lodge surrounded by dense pine forests and high fences. It was here that the presidency began to rot from the inside out. Zavidovo became the capital of the shadow state. In this isolated world, the harsh realities of starvation and inflation were kept at bay by high walls and endless banquets. The key figure in this tragedy emerges here, Alexander Korzhakov. Officially, Korzhakov was the head of the Presidential Security Service. In reality, he was the keeper of the bottle. Korzhakov understood Yeltsin's weakness better than anyone. He knew that a drunk president was a dependent president. He became the gatekeeper. If you wanted to see Yeltsin, you had to go through Korzhakov. And to go through Korzhakov, you often had to drink. The dynamic between them was toxic and codependent. Korzhakov would slice the sausage, pour the vodka, and listen to Yeltsin's drunken ramblings until the early hours of the morning. They created a court of the bottle, a hermetically sealed bubble where loyalty was measured in shots. In this environment, sobriety was viewed with suspicion. If a minister refused a drink, they were seen as not one of us. This filtered out competent, sober advisors and surrounded the president with sycophants who were willing to destroy their own livers to remain close to power. The terrifying truth of 1992 is that crucial decisions regarding the fate of a nuclear superpower were being made at 3 a.m. by men who were legally intoxicated. As the alcohol took a tighter grip, Yeltsin's behavior became increasingly erratic and aggressive. The mujik persona, the rough man of the people, curdled into something darker, a bully. He began to humiliate his subordinates for sport. He would force them to drink until they vomited. He would play cruel pranks. This was not just bad behavior. It was a symptom of the degradation of the frontal lobe. The alcohol was stripping away the layers of civilized inhibition, revealing a raw, wounded, and dangerous psyche underneath. But the real breaking point, the event that would sever Yeltsin's last tether to stability, was the constitutional crisis of 1993. This was the moment the Democrat died and the autocrat was born. The conflict was between the president and the Supreme Soviet. The parliament, led by Ruslan Khasbulatov and Alexander Rutskoy, blocked Yeltsin's reforms at every turn. But what truly enraged Yeltsin was not the politics. It was the personal insults. They knew his weakness. In speeches, they openly called him a drunkard. They mocked his red face. They questioned his sanity. For a narcissist like Yeltsin, whose entire self-worth was built on the image of strength, these insults were intolerable. They pierced the bubble of denial he had built at Zavidovo. The political struggle became a personal vendetta. He wasn't fighting for the Constitution. He was fighting to silence the voices that were telling the ugly truth about his addiction. The tension exploded in Black October of 1993. The parliament impeached him. Armed riots broke out in Moscow. The police lost control. On the night of October 3rd, the Russian Federation stood on the brink of civil war. The fate of the country hung in the balance. And where was the commander-in-chief? According to multiple accounts from aides present in the Kremlin that night, Yeltsin was in a state of strange, detached paralysis. The pressure was cataclysmic. His enemies were armed and barricaded in the White House, the same building that was the symbol of his 1991 victory. He had to make a decision that would stain his soul forever. He had to order the army to kill his former allies. He hesitated. The hesitation was not just moral, it was physical. He was exhausted. The stress triggered a massive craving for the sedative effects of alcohol. While his aides were screaming into telephones trying to rally the military districts, Yeltsin was struggling to maintain focus. Finally, he gave the order. He authorized the use of T-80 tanks to shell the parliament building in the center of Moscow. The morning of October 4th, 1993, is one of the darkest images in Russian history. Tanks lined up on the Kutuzovsky Bridge. They lowered their barrels. They fired high explosive shells into the white marble tower of the legislature. Black smoke billowed into the autumn sky. Live on CNN, the world watched the hero of democracy blow up his own parliament. Inside the Kremlin, as the shells were hitting their targets, Yeltsin did not stand at the window to watch. He reportedly withdrew to his office. He had won. He had crushed his enemies. But the psychological cost was total. He had crossed a line from which there was no return. He had shed the blood of his own people to stay in power. The cognitive dissonance was deafening. To silence the screaming in his head, he did the only thing he knew how to do. He drank. He drank to forget the sight of the burning building. He drank to forget the 147 dead bodies in the streets. He drank to forget that he had become a monster. The aftermath of 1993 marked a definitive shift in the nature of his alcoholism. Before this, he was a heavy drinker who could still function in bursts of brilliance. After 1993, he became a maintenance drinker. The guilt and the isolation were now permanent. The diplomatic colds began to appear in official press releases. Every time the president disappeared, the press secretary would claim he had a cold or flu. The international intelligence community knew exactly what these codes meant. A cold meant a binge. A severe cold meant he required an IV drip to detox. The West, specifically the Clinton administration, watched this deterioration with a mix of horror and pragmatism. They saw a man who was visibly disintegrating, but they made a calculated, cynical choice. A drunk Yeltsin was better than a sober communist. They decided to prop him up. They decided to ignore the smell of ethanol, the stumbling, and the glazed eyes. They enabled the addiction of a superpower's leader because it served their geopolitical interests. Yeltsin emerged from the ashes of 1993 as a czar. He rewrote the Constitution to give himself immense power, but physically, he was a wreck. His face was permanently swollen. His heart was weakening under the strain of the toxic levels of alcohol and the immense stress of the bloodshed. He began to suffer from micro-strokes and periods of memory loss. The man who walked out of the Kremlin in late 1993 was not the same man who walked in. The mujik was dead. What remained was a frightened, sick, and lonely old man who was terrified of losing power, yet terrified of the responsibilities that came with it. The dam had cracked. The private addiction had influenced a civil war. Now, it was about to spill onto the international stage. The next phase of the tragedy would not be hidden behind the walls of the Kremlin or the fences of Zavidovo. It would happen under the glare of the world's cameras in Berlin, in Shannon, and in Washington. The private shame was about to become public humiliation. If 1993 was the year Boris Yeltsin lost his soul in the smoke of the White House, 1994 was the year he lost his dignity on the world stage. In the pathology of alcoholism, there is a specific terrifying phase known as the loss of situational control. It is the point where the addict can no longer distinguish between a private living room and a public podium. The internal censor, the voice that whispers, "not here, not now," is silenced by the chemical erosion of the brain. For the president of the Russian Federation, this phase did not happen in a rehabilitation clinic. It happened on live television, broadcast to millions of households across the globe. We enter the summer of 1994. The geopolitical context is crucial. The Cold War is truly ending. The Red Army, the fearsome juggernaut that had occupied Eastern Europe for half a century, was finally packing its bags. On August 31st, 1994, Yeltsin arrived in Berlin to oversee the final withdrawal of Russian troops from German soil. This was a funeral for the Soviet Empire, for the Russian military officers present, men with chests full of medals and hearts full of bitterness. It was a day of profound mourning. They were leaving the lands their fathers had conquered with blood. The atmosphere demanded absolute solemnity. It demanded a leader who stood like a statue of grief and respect. Instead, they got a carnival. The timeline of that afternoon in Berlin is a study in disaster management. Before the ceremony, Yeltsin attended a lunch hosted by German Chancellor Helmut Kohl. Kohl, a man of immense physical and political stature, was Yeltsin's closest ally in the West. He knew Yeltsin's weakness, but even Kohl could not control the intake. Witnesses report that Yeltsin drank heavily during the meal: champagne, wine, and, inevitably, vodka. But unlike the mujik of the Urals, who could drink a liter and remain standing, the Yeltsin of 1994 was physically compromised. The alcohol hit his bloodstream like a sledgehammer. When the official ceremony began at the Treptow Park Memorial, the president was already in a state of manic intoxication. The footage of this event is perhaps the most painful document in the history of the Russian presidency. As the Berlin police band began to play a jaunty tune, something snapped in Yeltsin's mind. The solemnity bored him. The alcohol fueled a sudden, irrepressible urge to perform. He refused to be the mourner. He craved to be the star. He broke protocol. He lurched away from his security detail, his gait uneven and heavy. He approached the conductor of the band. In a moment of surreal horror, the president of Russia began to dance. It was not a ballroom dance. It was a clumsy, stomping jig. He waved his arms wildly. He blew kisses to the horrified German audience. He grabbed a microphone and tried to sing, his voice a guttural roar that bore no resemblance to the tune. The camera captures the reaction of the people around him. It is a masterclass in diplomatic panic. Helmut Kohl is seen laughing, but if you look at his eyes, there is no humor. There is fear. He physically positions himself near Yeltsin, ready to catch the leader of the nuclear superpower, should he fall face first onto the pavement. Cole is literally propping up the Russian Federation. But the most devastating reaction came from the Russian officers standing in formation behind him. These were the elite of the military. They stood rigid, saluting, their faces carved from stone. But in their eyes you can see the humiliation burning. They were watching their commander-in-chief turn their tragedy into a farce. They were being laughed at by the Germans, the very nation they had defeated 50 years prior. That afternoon in Berlin, Yeltsin didn't just embarrass himself, he severed the emotional bond with his own army. He proved to them that he was no longer one of them. He was a clown in a suit, dancing on the grave of their empire. The humiliation in Germany, however, was merely a prelude to a far more dangerous collapse. If Berlin was the explosion of manic energy, the incident at Shannon Airport only 1 month later was the implosion of total collapse. The contrast in atmosphere is stark. Berlin was bright, sunny, and loud. Shannon, Ireland, on September 30th, 1994, was gray, rainy, and silent. Yeltsin was returning from a summit in Washington. The flight plan included a 1-hour technical stopover at Shannon Airport. This was a standard diplomatic courtesy. The Irish Prime Minister Albert Reynolds was waiting on the tarmac to greet him. The red carpet was rolled out. The Irish military guard was assembled in the driving rain. The protocol was simple. The plane lands, the stairs roll up, the president descends, a handshake, a brief photo op, a drink in the VIP lounge, then departure. The Ilyushin IL-96 touched down on schedule. The engines whined to a halt. The stairs were positioned, the door was unlocked, and then nothing happened. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 20. The rain drummed on the fuselage. Prime Minister Reynolds checked his watch. He adjusted his tie. He waited. The diplomatic protocol officers began to whisper frantically into their radios. Inside the aircraft, a desperate drama was unfolding. This remains one of the most guarded secrets of the Yeltsin era, but accounts from bodyguards and aides have slowly pieced together the truth. Boris Yeltsin was not tired. He was unconscious. During the flight across the Atlantic, he had consumed a catastrophic amount of alcohol. By the time the wheels touched the Irish tarmac, he was in a state of comatose intoxication. His bodyguards, led by the ever-present Korzhakov, were in a panic. They tried everything to wake him. They shook him. They slapped his face. They splashed cold water on him. There are even rumors that they considered medical stimulants. But the president was a dead weight. He was beyond the reach of diplomacy. Outside, the situation was shifting from awkward to humiliating. Albert Reynolds was left standing in the rain like a jilted lover. Finally, the decision was made. The door would stay closed. Alexander Soskovets, the first deputy prime minister, descended the stairs alone. He looked pale and terrified. He told the Prime Minister of Ireland that the president was very tired and would not be disembarking. The plane refueled and took off, leaving a diplomatic scandal in its wake. The next morning, the world's press did not use euphemisms. The headlines screamed, "Russian president too drunk to get off plane," circling over Shannon. The excuse of fatigue was laughed out of the room. The Shannon incident was a pivotal turning point in global perception. Berlin could be dismissed as exuberance or eccentricity, but Shannon? Shannon was incapacitation. This was the terrifying realization for Western intelligence agencies. There were windows of time, hours at a stretch, where the president of Russia could not be woken up. What if a nuclear early warning system had triggered a false alarm during that hour on the tarmac? What if a terrorist attack had occurred? The chain of command was broken. The nuclear football was sitting in a cabin next to a man who couldn't remember his own name. Shannon proved that the addiction was no longer a personal vice. It was a national security threat of the highest order. This duality, the manic clown in Berlin and the comatose invalid in Shannon, revealed the chaotic nature of his decline. Medically, his liver was failing to process the toxins, leading to a buildup of ammonia in the blood, which causes confusion and encephalopathy. His heart was enlarging. The blood flow to his brain was inconsistent. The mujik, who could drink all night and work all day, was gone. In his place was a frail biological machine that was breaking down in public view. But the most tragic element of 1994 was the reaction of Yeltsin himself. When he sobered up after Shannon, he was reportedly mortified. He knew he had failed. But the shame did not drive him to sobriety. The shame was too painful to bear without anesthesia. So, the cycle tightened. He drank to forget the shame of Shannon, which led to the next incident, which led to more shame and more vodka. By the end of 1994, the image of Boris Yeltsin had fundamentally changed. He was no longer the fearless Democrat. He was the drunken bear. He had become a caricature. And in the ruthless world of Russian politics, a leader can survive being hated, but he cannot survive being laughed at. The vultures, the oligarchs, the opposition, and the ambitious spies in the security services began to circle. They smelled the weakness. They knew the Tsar was dying one bottle at a time. By the beginning of 1995, the alcoholism of Boris Yeltsin had ceased to be a private medical matter and had metastasized into the single greatest variable in global security. In the intelligence bunkers of the CIA, MI6, and the DGSE, the daily briefings on Russia no longer focused primarily on troop movements or economic output. They focused on the liver enzymes, the dilation of the pupils, and the speech patterns of one man. The Western powers faced a dilemma that was as moral as it was strategic. They knew with absolute forensic certainty that the president of the Russian Federation was physically and mentally disintegrating. They knew that his periods of lucidity were shrinking, replaced by long, dark stretches of comatose stupor and manic aggression. The question facing Washington, London, and Berlin was stark. Do we expose the emperor's frailty and risk a communist restoration or a nationalist coup? Or do we become accomplices in the deception? In a decision that would define the post-Cold War era, the West chose the latter. They chose to become the enablers of the alcoholic czar. This decision created a conspiracy of silence that turned international diplomacy into a high-stakes theater of the absurd, where the most powerful leaders on earth were forced to play the role of caretakers to a man who could barely stand. The epicenter of this dynamic was the relationship between Boris Yeltsin and Bill Clinton. The media dubbed it the Bill and Boris Show. On the surface, it was portrayed as a warm, rugged brotherhood between two charismatic political animals. They were both big men. They were both populists. They both had appetites for life that bordered on the gluttonous. But beneath the smiles, the bear hugs, and the backslapping lay a deeply dysfunctional, almost abusive codependency. Forensic analysis of the White House records from this period reveals a different story. Bill Clinton was not just a partner, he was a nurse. His aides, including Strobe Talbot, described meetings with Yeltsin not as diplomatic negotiations, but as therapy sessions and suicide watch. Clinton, a man with a preternatural gift for empathy and a history of dealing with addiction in his own family, became the narcissist whisperer. He understood that Yeltsin was driven by a deep, insecurity-fueled need for validation. Yeltsin needed to feel like a giant, even as he was shrinking. Clinton's strategy was to feed that delusion. He would hug him, praise him, and laugh at his incomprehensible jokes, all to keep the nuclear codes in friendly hands. This dynamic reached its visual and theatrical peak on October 23, 1995, at the Franklin D. Roosevelt National Historic Site in Hyde Park, New York. The summit was intended to be a serious discussion on Bosnia and nuclear nonproliferation. Instead, it became a spectacle of humiliation. The footage of the press conference remains one of the most uncomfortable artifacts of the 1990s. Boris Yeltsin stands at the podium. His face is a deep, alarming crimson, a sign of extreme hypertension and vasodilation caused by alcohol. He is sweating. His eyes are darting wildly. He begins to speak, but he is not addressing the policy issues. He launches into a manic, aggressive tirade against the press. He points a shaking finger at the journalists, mocking them for predicting that the meeting would be a failure. "You said it would be a disaster," he shouts, his voice cracking. "But now I tell you, you are the ones who failed." He laughs, a guttural booming sound that echoes off the trees. And then we see Bill Clinton. The President of the United States doubles over. He laughs so hard that tears stream from his eyes. He clutches his sides. He leans onto the podium for support. To the casual observer watching on the evening news, this looked like genuine mirth. It looked like two old friends sharing a joke. But a psychological lens reveals a darker truth behind Clinton's reaction. This was not the laughter of humor, but of hysteria, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. For hours leading up to that moment, Clinton and his team had been in a state of terror. They knew Yeltsin had been drinking. They knew he was volatile. They were terrified he would vomit on live television, or fall off the stage, or declare war on a reporter. When Yeltsin finished his rant without physically collapsing, the tension inside Clinton snapped. The laughter was a biological release mechanism. It was the sound of a man realizing that they had survived another day without the apocalypse. But while Clinton laughed, the Russian delegation sat in stone-faced silence. They knew that their president was being treated like a court jester. They saw the laughter for what it was, pity. But if Hyde Park was a public farce, the events that took place just weeks earlier in the shadows of Washington, D.C., were a private horror story. This event, known in classified circles as the Blair House incident, is the single most terrifying example of how Yeltsin's addiction compromised the safety of the human race. It was late September 1995. Boris Yeltsin was staying at Blair House, the official guest residence of the U.S. president, located directly across Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House. Blair House is a fortress. It is guarded by the elite of the U.S. Secret Service and the Russian Federal Protective Service. It is supposed to be impenetrable. On the night in question, the demons returned to Boris Yeltsin. He was drinking alone in his suite. The alcohol he consumed that night triggered a fugue state, a dissociative episode common in late-stage alcoholism, where the subject loses all sense of time, place, and identity. The president of Russia ceased to be a head of state. He became a confused, hungry, and paranoid man. According to the secret diaries of calm historian Taylor Branch, who recorded Clinton's own recollections of the event, Yeltsin managed to slip away from his bodyguards. This fact alone is staggering. The Russian security detail, usually glued to his side, had either fallen asleep or had been dismissed by a bellicose president. Yeltsin navigated the labyrinthine corridors of Blair House. He found a side exit. He opened it. The scene is surreal. It is well past midnight. Pennsylvania Avenue is dark, save for the streetlights and the distant glow of the monuments. A man is standing on the sidewalk. He is wearing only his underwear. He is shivering. He is waving his arms frantically at the passing cars. That man commands the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet. Yeltsin was trying to hail a taxi. In his drunken delirium, he had decided he wanted a pizza. He did not call the kitchen. He did not wake his aides. His brain had reverted to a primitive logic. Hungry, pizza, taxi, go. When Secret Service agents patrolling the perimeter spotted him, they initially froze. The cognitive dissonance was too great. They were trained to look for assassins, for terrorists, for intruders. They were not trained to handle a superpower leader clad only in his underwear trying to flag down a cab. They approached him with caution, but Yeltsin was not compliant. He was belligerent. The alcohol had stripped away his inhibitions and replaced them with aggression. When the agents tried to usher him back inside, he slurred his words, shouting about his rights, shouting about pizza. For several minutes, a terrifying standoff occurred. The agents could not touch him. He was a foreign head of state, yet they could not let him wander into the streets of Washington. If a tourist had walked by with a camera, if a journalist had been awake, if a mugger had approached him, the entire geopolitical order hung by a thread on that sidewalk. Finally, the agents managed to coax the president of the Russian Federation back through the gates, not with diplomacy, but with the promise that they would order the pizza for him. The horror of this incident lies in the details. During those minutes on the street, where was the Cheget, the nuclear briefcase? It was back in the suite, or in the hands of an aide who was asleep. The chain of command was physically severed. If a false alarm had triggered the Russian early warning systems at that exact moment, a scenario that happened multiple times in the 90s, the military would have tried to contact the president. They would have found an empty room. Or worse, they would have found a man in his briefs chewing on a slice of pepperoni, unable to understand the words launch detection. The nightmare did not end there. The following night, the alcohol-induced psychosis deepened. Yeltsin, again at Blair House, hallucinated. Paranoia, a classic symptom of withdrawal and toxicity, seized his brain. He believed he was being assassinated. He believed the walls were closing in. He stumbled down the back stairs of the residence, clad in his nightclothes. A basement security guard, a young American officer, looked up to see the president of Russia charging at him. Yeltsin mistook the guard for an assassin. He began to scream. The Secret Service agents had to physically intervene to prevent an international incident. They had to restrain a hallucinating Boris Yeltsin from attacking a federal officer. The next morning, the cleanup operation began. The Clinton administration immediately classified the reports. They understood the stakes. If the American Congress, led by the hawkish Newt Gingrich, knew that the Russian president was wandering Washington in his underwear hunting for pizza, the entire aid package to Russia would be canceled. The support for NATO expansion, the disarmament treaties, everything would collapse. So they buried it. They lied. They told the press the visit was a resounding success. They praised Yeltsin's vigor. This was the depth of the complicity. The West did not just tolerate Yeltsin's alcoholism. They insulated him from the consequences of it. They built a wall of silence around him. But silence has a cost. The Russian delegation knew what happened. The bodyguards knew. The aides knew. They returned to Moscow with a profound sense of shame. They saw that their leader was a laughingstock. This deep, festering humiliation began to curdle into resentment. They felt that the West enjoyed this spectacle. They began to suspect that the Americans wanted a drunk Yeltsin because a drunk Yeltsin was easy to manipulate. He would sign anything. He would agree to anything. This suspicion planted the seeds of the anti-Americanism that would consume Russia a decade later. Every time Bill Clinton hugged a stumbling Yeltsin, he was inadvertently writing the campaign slogans for Vladimir Putin. The Russian establishment looked at the pizza incident and the Hyde Park laughter, and they vowed never again. Never again would they allow a leader to be weak. Never again would they allow the West to laugh. By the winter of 1995, the physical toll of this lifestyle was becoming undeniable. The alcohol was eating his heart muscle. He suffered 2 heart attacks in quick succession. He began to disappear for weeks into the Central Clinical Hospital. His speech became permanently slurred. The 1996 presidential election was looming, and the polls showed Yeltsin with single-digit support. The communists were rising. The West was terrified. The stage was set for the ultimate act of deception. The campaign of 1996 would not be a political contest. It would be a medical conspiracy. The goal was no longer to govern Russia. The goal was to prop up a dying, delirious man just long enough to cross the finish line. They would pump him full of stimulants, paint his face to hide the gray pallor of death, and drag him across the stage, shielding the voters from the truth that the man they were re-electing was already gone. If the previous years of Boris Yeltsin's presidency were a tragedy of behavioral excess, the year 1996 was a tragedy of biological collapse. It was the year the bill for decades of ethanol abuse finally arrived, and the interest rate was lethal. This brings us to the dark heart of the narrative, the 1996 presidential election. Western historians often categorize this event as a victory for democracy over communism. However, a forensic examination of the medical and political records reveals a different reality. Whatever pretense of a political campaign existed, it had dissolved into a high-stakes medical experiment. It was an act of political necromancy. The objective of the Kremlin's inner circle was no longer to present a competent leader to the electorate. It was to drag a dying man across the finish line before his heart stopped beating completely. The context of January 1996 was desperate. Boris Yeltsin was, by all statistical metrics, a political corpse. His approval rating had flatlined at 6%, a number lower than the margin of error. The Russian population despised him. The shock therapy economic reforms had wiped out their savings. The war in Chechnya had become a bloody, humiliating quagmire, with thousands of young Russian conscripts returning in zinc coffins. The streets were ruled by gangsters, the hospitals were empty of medicine, and the drunken president had become a national punchline. Looming on the horizon was the Communist Party candidate, Gennady Zyuganov. Zyuganov was surging in the polls. He promised a return to order, a return to stability, and punishment for the corrupt elite. For the West, a communist victory was the ultimate geopolitical nightmare. For the Russian oligarchs, the small cabal of billionaires who had feasted on the carcass of the Soviet economy, a communist victory meant prison, confiscation of assets, or execution. Faced with this existential threat, a dark pact was formed in the Swiss resort town of Davos. The oligarchs, who usually spent their time fighting each other, formed a united front. They pledged their unlimited financial resources and their total control of the television networks to one singular cause, the re-election of Boris Yeltsin. But they had a problem. Their candidate was physically disintegrating. The medical reality of Boris Yeltsin in early 1996 was a state secret guarded more closely than the nuclear launch codes. The alcohol had ravaged his cardiovascular system. His heart was enlarged to dangerous proportions, a condition known as cardiomegaly. The muscle walls were thin and flaccid, struggling to pump blood through arteries that were hardened by years of stress and toxicity. His liver was fatty and scarred, unable to effectively filter toxins from his blood. His brain function was intermittent, suffering from ischemia, a lack of oxygen, which caused periods of confusion, memory loss, and slurred speech. To put this man on a grueling cross-country campaign trail was not just reckless, it was a death sentence. But Yeltsin, driven by a stubborn suicidal pride and a fear of irrelevance, refused to step aside. He decided to fight. And so, the handlers, his daughter Tatiana Dyachenko, and the media strategist Anatoly Shubais, devised a strategy of total deception. They needed to hide the invalid and project the mujik. They needed to convince the Russian babushkas that the bear was still strong, still virile, still capable of leading the pack. To achieve this, they turned the campaign into a medical thriller. The president was placed on a regimen of powerful stimulants and painkillers designed to override his body's desperate signals to stop. They engineered a campaign schedule that required bursts of manic energy followed by long periods of total collapse. This brings us to the most grotesque and visually haunting images of the campaign, the pop star tour. In city after city, Yeltsin would appear on stage at rock concerts. The music was loud, thumping techno or rock and roll, designed to appeal to the youth vote. And there, in the center of the flashing lights, was a 65-year-old man with advanced heart disease dancing. The footage of Yeltsin dancing in Rostov-on-Don is often played in documentaries as a highlight reel of his charisma. But we must look closer. We must look with the eyes of a doctor. This is not the dance of a healthy man enjoying the music. This is the frantic, jerky, spasmodic movement of a man operating on a chemical cocktail. His face is a mask of red, sweaty exertion. His eyes are glazed. He twists. He stomps. He shouts into the microphone. It is a dance macabre, a dance of death. What the cameras did not show was the aftermath. Witnesses and bodyguards have since revealed that the moment Yeltsin stepped off these stages, he would practically collapse. He would be caught by his security detail, his chest heaving, gasping for air, his heart fluttering like a trapped bird. Doctors were waiting behind the curtains with oxygen tanks, defibrillators, and syringes full of cardiac medication. They would stabilize him, drag him to the limousine, and rush him to the nearest sanatorium to recover for the next performance. He was literally killing himself for votes. Then the inevitable happened. The biological machine broke. It was June 26, 1996. The first round of voting was over, and Yeltsin had scraped through to the runoff against the communist Zhuganov. The final vote was days away. The pressure was cataclysmic. At his dacha in the countryside, Boris Yeltsin suffered a massive heart attack. It was his third major cardiac event in a year. This was the big one. Under any normal political system in any other country, this would be the end. The news would break. The candidate would withdraw. The vice president or prime minister would take charge. But this was Russia in the 1990s. The truth was a flexible commodity, and the stakes were too high for honesty. A terrifying cover-up operation was launched, reminiscent of the darkest days of the Soviet Politburo. The inner circle, the family and the oligarchs, made a cold calculation. If the voters knew Yeltsin was dying, they would vote for the communist. Therefore, the voters could not know. The president disappeared from public view. The official Kremlin spokesman Sergei Yastrzemski faced the international press corps and lied without blinking. He told the world that the president had lost his voice due to excessive campaigning. He called it a sore throat. He claimed Yeltsin was resting at his dacha, reviewing documents and preparing for the next term. In reality, the president of the Russian Federation was lying in a hospital bed at the Barvika Sanatorium, hovering in the gray zone between life and death. He was connected to monitors. He could not stand. He could not speak coherently. The nuclear briefcase, the Shege, was in the room, sitting on a chair, but the man supposed to operate it was incapable of feeding himself, let alone authorizing a strike. The chain of command was a fiction. The media became complicit in this deception. The television channels owned by the oligarchs who needed a Yeltsin victory to survive stopped asking questions. They participated in a deep fake operation before the technology even existed. They aired old pre-recorded footage of Yeltsin meeting with aides, passing it off as live coverage to prove he was working. They edited interviews to remove the long pauses and the slurring. They created a virtual president. On July 3, 1996, the Russian people went to the polls. They were voting for a ghost. They cast their ballots for an image they saw on a TV screen, unaware that the real man was catheterized and heavily sedated in a forest clinic. The deception worked. Yeltsin won. The West breathed a sigh of relief. Bill Clinton congratulated his friend. Democracy, they said, had prevailed. But the victory was hollow. The truth could not be hidden forever. The inauguration ceremony that followed in August 1996 was the final undeniable proof of his destruction. Traditionally, a Russian inauguration is a grand imperial affair. It involves an hour-long speech, a parade, a display of vigor and promise. Yeltsin's inauguration lasted exactly 45 seconds. The footage of this event is heartbreaking to watch. The doors of the Kremlin Palace of Congresses open. Boris Yeltsin enters, but enters is too strong a word. He shuffles. He looks shrunken, as if his skeleton has collapsed inside his suit. His skin is the color of old parchment. He walks with the terrifying fragility of a man walking on ice. He grips the podium not for authority, but because without it, he would fall. He mumbles the oath of office. He struggles to form the words. His breath is shallow. He does not make a speech. He cannot. The energy required to speak for 5 minutes would likely trigger another cardiac arrest. He stands there, a broken shell, while the anthem plays. The camera pans to the audience, the generals, the ministers, the foreign dignitaries. You can see the fear in their eyes. They realized in that silent hall that there was no president. There was only a vacuum. This marked the beginning of the Regency. For the next 3 years, Russia was not ruled by Boris Yeltsin. It was ruled by the family, a shadow cabal consisting of his daughter Tatiana, his chief of staff Valentin Yumashev, and the oligarch Boris Berezovsky. They controlled access to the bedroom. They controlled the signature stamp. They controlled the flow of information. Yeltsin became a prisoner in his own residence, a King Lear figure raging against his own infirmity. His relationship with alcohol during this period shifted again. He could no longer binge in the traditional sense. His heart was too weak to survive a liter of vodka. But the addiction found new pathways. He continued to drink covertly. Nurses reported finding hidden bottles stashed in his bathroom, in his wardrobe, even in his medical supply cabinet. He would drink to numb the pain of the chest surgery, a quintuple bypass performed in late 1996 by the American surgeon Michael DeBakey. He would drink to escape the humiliation of his irrelevance. The alcohol began to interact with the heavy cocktail of heart medications, blood thinners, and painkillers he was prescribed. This chemical mixture led to periods of profound disorientation. Western leaders continued to visit, but the meetings became tragic farces. Helmut Kohl and Jacques Chirac would fly to Moscow, sit with Yeltsin for 20 minutes, listen to him mumble about great Russia or make bizarre, unrelated comments, and then leave to do the actual business with the prime minister. They treated him like an elderly relative who needed to be humored, not a global partner. The physical deterioration was now affecting his motor skills and his senses permanently. He lost part of his hearing. His movements became slow and deliberate, as if he were moving underwater. This was the zombie phase of the presidency. The country lurched from crisis to crisis. The 1998 financial default, the collapse of the ruble, the miners' strikes, and the man at the helm was often found watching cartoons in his bathrobe or staring out the window at the falling snow, unable to comprehend the economic charts being placed in front of him. The tragedy of 1996 is not just that a sick man was reelected. It is that the system conspired to put the survival of a regime above the safety of a nation. By propping up Yeltsin, they delayed the necessary political evolution of Russia. They created a power vacuum that allowed corruption to metastasize into every organ of the state. The walking corpse of 1996 paved the way for the authoritarian backlash that was to come. The Russian people, seeing their democracy, led by a senile absentee landlord, began to lose faith in the very concept of freedom. They began to crave order. They began to crave a strong hand. They began to crave someone who could stand up without holding onto a podium. The stage was now set for the final act. The family knew that Yeltsin could not last forever. They needed an exit strategy. They needed a successor who would protect them, someone who was the opposite of the chaotic, drunken giant they had managed for so long. They began to look for a man who was sober, sharp, and invisible. And deep in the archives of the security services, they found him. By the beginning of 1997, the Kremlin had ceased to function as a modern executive branch of government. It had transformed into something far more archaic and terrifying. A medieval court of intrigue, physically resembling a hospice, ruled by a King Lear figure who was slowly losing his grip on reality. Following the quintuple bypass surgery of late 1996, the mujik, the robust, barrel-chested construction foreman who could outdrink and outshout any man in Russia, was gone forever. In his place sat a frighteningly volatile invalid. The surgery had repaired his heart, but it could not repair the neurological damage caused by a decade of ethanol abuse. The medical reality of Boris Yeltsin in this period is crucial to understanding the political chaos that followed. He was no longer just drinking vodka. He was consuming a lethal, unregulated cocktail of alcohol, beta blockers, heavy painkillers, and antidepressants. This chemical mixture did not just intoxicate him, it fundamentally altered his personality. The winter patriarch was paranoid, vindictive, and prone to rapid, violent mood swings. He would weep uncontrollably in the morning and scream in a fit of rage by the afternoon. He became obsessed with his own relevance, terrified that he was being laughed at, terrified that he was being erased. Into this vacuum stepped the family. This was the unofficial Regency Council that effectively ruled Russia from 1997 to 1999. It consisted of his daughter, Tatiana Dyachenko, who became the gatekeeper of the president's body, Valentin Yumashev, the ghostwriter turned chief of staff, and Boris Berezovsky, the mathematician turned oligarch who acted as the Rasputin of the court. Their primary objective was no longer the welfare of the Russian state, the economy, or the military. Their sole objective was the physical preservation of the president and the financial preservation of their own assets. They built a sanitized reality around Yeltsin. They filtered the newspapers he read. They controlled the television channels he watched. They blocked visitors who might bring bad news. For months at a time, Boris Yeltsin lived in a delusion, believing he was the master of a recovering superpower, while outside the high fences of his residence, the country was sliding into the abyss. But there was one thing the family could not control: the president's manic impulse to assert his authority. Since Yeltsin could no longer project strength through physical vigor, he began to project it through administrative violence. He began to treat the Russian government like a deck of cards, shuffling and discarding prime ministers with the frantic energy of a gambler trying to change his luck. This period, known to historians as the prime ministerial leapfrog, was the final undeniable symptom of his political delirium. It began in March 1998. In a fit of inexplicable pique, likely fueled by a bout of drinking and a perceived slight on television, Yeltsin fired Viktor Chernomyrdin. Chernomyrdin had been the gray cardinal, the reliable, boring heavyweight who had managed the economy for years. He was the anchor. Firing him was an act of madness. In his place, Yeltsin appointed Sergei Kirienko, a 35-year-old technocrat with the face of a schoolboy who the Russian press mercilessly nicknamed Kinder Surprise. The result was catastrophic. The markets panicked, the sharks circled. On August 17, 1998, the Russian financial system collapsed. The government defaulted on its debt. The ruble lost 2/3 of its value in a month. The savings of the emerging middle class, the very people who had supported Yeltsin in 1991, were incinerated. The social contract was broken. Yeltsin's reaction to the crash was not to take responsibility but to panic. He fired Kirienko. He tried to bring back Chernomyrdin, but the parliament rebelled. Cornered, humiliated, and likely intoxicated, Yeltsin was forced to appoint Yevgeny Primakov as prime minister. The appointment of Primakov is a pivotal moment in the psychology of the transition. Primakov was the anti-Yeltsin. He was a former spy master, a creature of the KGB, a sober, heavy-lidded intellectual who was immensely popular with the public. Yeltsin hated him. He hated him because Primakov was sober. He hated him because Primakov was respected. But most of all, the family feared him. Primakov began to launch anti-corruption investigations. He began to look into the accounts of Berezovsky. He began to look at the finances of the presidential administration. The danger was now existential. The Regency realized that if Yeltsin died or stepped down while Primakov was in power, they would not just lose their jobs, they would go to prison. They needed a new successor. They needed an exit strategy. They needed a man who possessed a specific paradoxical set of traits, someone who was an outsider to the Moscow elite, yet a product of the system, someone who was disciplined and sober, yet loyal to a fault, someone who was invisible enough to be elected, but strong enough to protect them. They began to scour the personnel files of the security services. They looked for a gray mouse, and deep in the archives of the Lubyanka, they found Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. The contrast between Boris Yeltsin and Vladimir Putin was visually and psychologically jarring. It was the contrast between a dying, chaotic empire and a cold, efficient machine. Yeltsin was 6 feet 2 inches tall, loud, emotional, and reeking of alcohol. Putin was small, quiet, icy, and a teetotaler. Yeltsin was a populist who fed on the energy of crowds. Putin was a spy who preferred the shadows. In August 1999, Yeltsin fired Primakov, then fired his replacement Sergei Stepashin after just 3 months, and appointed Vladimir Putin as prime minister. The Russian elite laughed. They thought Putin was just another disposable pawn in the Mad King's game. They called him Yeltsin's poodle. They did not understand that the poodle was a wolf. The grand bargain that was struck in the autumn of 1999 remains one of the most consequential secret agreements of modern history. Though the specific conversation was never recorded, the terms were clear from the actions that followed. Yeltsin would abdicate. He would hand over the presidency to Putin before the election, giving the young spy the massive advantage of incumbency. In exchange, Putin would guarantee the one thing Yeltsin craved more than vodka: safety. The timeline moves to the final day of the century, December 31st, 1999. The stage management of this day was brilliant and brutal. The world was preparing for champagne and fireworks. Boris Yeltsin was preparing to surrender. The camera crew arrived at the Kremlin in the early morning. They were told it was for a standard New Year's greeting. When they entered the president's office, they were shocked by what they saw. Yeltsin sat at his desk, the Russian flag draped behind him. He looked ancient. His face was puffy, a roadmap of broken capillaries and swollen tissue. His eyes were heavy with a decade of exhaustion. He was not the firebrand standing on the tank in 1991. He was a broken shell. The makeup artists spent an hour trying to make him look alive. They applied layers of foundation to hide the gray pallor of heart failure. They fixed his hair. When the cameras rolled, Yeltsin began to read the teleprompter. But then he did something unexpected. He deviated from the script. He looked into the lens, into the living rooms of millions of Russians whose lives had been turned upside down by his shock therapy. And he delivered the most human line of his entire presidency. I ask for your forgiveness. He did not blame the communists. He did not blame the West. He admitted that the pain had been too great. He admitted that he had been naive. I want to ask forgiveness for the fact that many of our dreams did not come true, and what seemed simple to us turned out to be tormentingly difficult. It was a moment of startling clarity. For a few minutes, the fog of addiction lifted, and he saw the wreckage he was leaving behind. He saw the poverty. He saw the oligarchs stealing the national wealth. He saw the Chechen war. He saw the humiliation of a superpower. And then the act was done. He signed the resignation papers. He turned to Vladimir Putin, who was standing in the corner, watching with eyes that betrayed absolutely no emotion. The nuclear briefcase, the Shaget, was brought forward. The symbolism of this transfer is the defining image of the Russian 21st century. The drunken Tsar, shaking and tearful, handed the weapon of the apocalypse to the sober spy. Yeltsin reportedly whispered to Putin, "Take care of Russia." It was a plea, but it was also a confession that he had failed to do so himself. Putin walked Yeltsin to the door. He helped the old man put on his coat. It was a gesture of respect, but also a gesture of dismissal. Yeltsin walked out into the cold Moscow air. The snow was falling. He climbed into his limousine. For the first time in a decade, the nuclear football was not in the car with him. The red phone was disconnected. The burden was gone. Putin returned to the office. His first act as acting president was not to fix the economy or address the military. His first act was to sign a decree on guarantees for the former president of the Russian Federation and the members of his family. It granted Boris Yeltsin absolute lifelong immunity from criminal prosecution, interrogation, or search. The deal was sealed. The family was safe. The oligarchs breathed a sigh of relief, temporarily. But for the Russian people, the long nightmare of the 90s was over. They didn't care about the immunity deal. They didn't care about the backroom politics. They looked at their televisions and they saw a man who spoke in complete, sharp sentences. They saw a man who did not stumble. They saw a man who was sober. Boris Yeltsin went home to his dacha. He took the bottle with him. But now it didn't matter. He could drink himself into oblivion, and the world would keep turning without him. The era of chaos was over. The era of order and the authoritarianism that came with it had begun. The alcohol that had fueled the destruction of the Soviet Union had finally finished its work. It had dissolved a democracy and crystallized a dictatorship. The first morning of the year 2000 broke over Moscow with a strange, unfamiliar silence. For the first time in a decade, the phone on the desk of Boris Yeltsin did not ring. The nuclear briefcase was gone. The generals were gone. The flatterers, the oligarchs, and the drinking buddies had all migrated, like a flock of birds sensing a change in the wind, to the office of the new man, Vladimir Putin. Boris Yeltsin was left alone in the golden cage of his government dacha in Barvika. He had secured his immunity, but he had lost his relevance. And for a man whose entire metabolic rate was fueled by the addiction to power, this silence was a new kind of death. The retirement of Boris Yeltsin was not a peaceful twilight. It was a slow, agonizing suffocation. He was a prisoner of the very safety he had negotiated. He lived behind high walls, surrounded by guards who were there to protect him, but also to watch him. He spent his days wandering the manicured gardens, a ghost haunting his own life. Reports from the few visitors allowed inside paint a picture of profound melancholy. He would sit for hours in front of the television, watching the news. He watched as Vladimir Putin systematically dismantled the democratic institutions Yeltsin had built. He watched the independent television station NTV, the mouthpiece of the free press, being raided and seized by the state. He watched the return of the Soviet national anthem. He watched the governors he had appointed being fired. He saw it all, and he understood with the terrible clarity of hindsight what he had done. He had saved his own skin by selling the soul of his democracy to a KGB colonel. But he could not speak. He was bound by the unwritten code of the transition, silence in exchange for safety. So, the frustration turned inward. The drinking continued, but it was no longer the raucous public binging of the 90s. It was the quiet, desperate drinking of an old man trying to numb the realization that his legacy was being erased in real time. On April the 23rd, 2007, the biological bill finally came due. Boris Yeltsin's heart, that battered and large scarred muscle that had survived political coups, tank assaults, and oceans of vodka, finally stopped beating. The cause of death was congestive heart failure. It was not a sudden event. It was the inevitable conclusion of a 30-year suicide note written in ethanol. The state funeral was held at the Cathedral of Christ the Savior in Moscow. The symbolism was blinding. This was the cathedral that Stalin had blown up, and which Yeltsin had rebuilt. He lay in an open casket, his face pale and waxy, finally at rest. The guest list was a tableau of the tragedy we have just witnessed. Bill Clinton was there, looking older and somber, standing over the body of the friend he had enabled and laughed at. Vladimir Putin was there, looking sharp and impenetrable, the beneficiary of the chaos. But the most telling image was the line of ordinary Russians waiting to pay their respects. They did not weep with the hysteria that accompanied the death of Stalin. They did not mourn with the love that accompanied the death of a saint. They stood in a respectful, confused silence. They were burying a paradox. They were burying the man who had given them freedom, but who had made that freedom so painful, so chaotic, and so humiliating that they had gladly traded it back for order. As the coffin was lowered into the ground at the Novodevichy Cemetery, a chapter of history closed. But the forensic audit of his life leaves us with a haunting conclusion. Boris Yeltsin was not destroyed by his enemies. The communists did not defeat him. The coup plotters did not defeat him. The West did not defeat him. He was destroyed by the hamartia, the fatal flaw that lived inside his own blood. He was a giant who possessed the physical courage to stand on a tank and stop an army, but lacked the moral courage to put down the glass. He was a man who had the strength to tear down an empire of lies, but lacked the strength to face the truth of his own reflection without anesthesia. The tragedy of the 1990s is not that Russia was ruled by a bad man, it is that it was ruled by an impaired man. We often worry about the madman theory of nuclear war, the fear that a leader will press the button out of rage or ideological zeal. But the story of Boris Yeltsin teaches us a more terrifying lesson. The true danger is not the rage of the sober, it is the negligence of the drunk. For a decade, the world spun on the edge of a knife, held by a hand that trembled. We survived not because of wise statesmanship, but because of dumb luck. History will remember Boris Yeltsin as the father of the Russian Federation. It will carve his name in stone as the man who buried communism. But in the footnotes, in the medical files, and in the memories of those who watched him stumble on the world stage, another truth will remain. He was the man who inherited a superpower and left behind a warning. The warning is simple. The health of the state can never be separated from the health of the leader. When the head is intoxicated, the body politic staggers. Boris Yeltsin won the battle for history, but he lost the battle for himself. And in the end, as the lights go out in the Kremlin and the snow falls on his grave, we are left with the final tragic image. A man sitting alone in a room, holding the power of a god, but unable to find the strength to put the bottle down.